The platform has been empty for 512 years, and the placard above it still reads, in 19 languages, what they decided we were. The Sorathi Convocation Accord keeps its records well. That is the first thing you need to understand about them. Every session logged, every motion filed, every species classified and reclassified and assigned to its appropriate tier, its appropriate platform, its appropriate place in the order of things. The hall at Soratha Prime has 847 active member delegations, and each one sits at a platform calibrated to its status height determined by vote, by resource contribution, by the judgment of a body that has been making these decisions for 2,000 years. Humanity's platform sits 3 steps below all the others. The placard is still there. Someone updates it every year in all 19 languages, because that is what the administrative record requires. 512 years ago, a human delegation walked out of this hall without a word. No argument, no threat, no tears. They left one thing on the stone table at the base of their platform, a thermos brushed copper engraved with a harbor skyline so faded you could barely read it. The hall celebrated around it. Someone noted it in the session record as personal effects unclaimed. No one moved it for 11 days. What happened in the years that followed is the subject of this account. Here is what the Accord assumed. A species classified as presapient animals, the formal designation used for populations deemed incapable of sustained institutional participation, would do one of 2 things. It would push back and be managed, or it would disappear and be forgotten. These were the only models the Accord had ever needed. In 2,000 years of operation, covering the classification, reclassification, integration, and dissolution of more than 1,200 species, no other outcome had ever been recorded. They were not wrong to assume this. They were wrong to assume that the absence of evidence was the same as the absence of activity. This is the story of what was built in the silence. Before the vote, 9 years before, to be precise, a woman named Director Orang Castle sat alone in a room on Earth and finished the mathematics. She was not the ambassador. She was not a diplomat. She was a proceduralist, which is a specific kind of person, someone who reads the rules of a system until they understand not just what the rules say, but what the rules assume, what they are built to prevent, what they were never designed to stop. She had read 600 years of Accord membership history, all of it, the session transcripts, the filed motions, the administrative rulings, the appeals and counter-appeals and procedural challenges that had piled up across centuries like sediment at the bottom of a slow river. She had counted 14 vetoed relief motions, 3 redirected colony corridors, 112 species reclassified downward in a 50-year window, most of them too small to contest the vote. She had read the founding charter 12 times, and on the 12th reading she found the clause that no one had invoked in 200 years, Article 9, Clause 4, the one that allowed a formally expelled species to petition for reinstatement as senior member, with full veto authority, provided it could demonstrate sustained institutional engagement during its period of absence. No one had ever tried to invoke it. No one had ever been absent long enough, or organized enough, or patient enough. Director Orang Castle looked at the math and understood that the vote was already decided. It had been decided years before it was scheduled. The only question remaining was what to do with the interval. She wrote a proposal, 1,200 pages, printed on archival paper, the binding already warping from the humidity in the room where she worked. She brought it to a closed session of the Earth Federated Council 6 months later and presented it without slides, without a summary, without a shortened version. If they were going to do this, they needed to understand all of it. The proposal had one central argument. Do not contest the expulsion, accept it, disappear completely, and spend every year of absence becoming something the Accord has no instrument to model. The Council took 11 days to vote. They voted yes by a margin of 3. What followed was this. All human beacon signals ceased within 4 months. The shutdown was staggered, system by system, so the pattern would read as infrastructure degradation rather than intentional withdrawal. Trade was rerouted through 2 proxy intermediaries, the Sulhari Compact and the Dreven Free Lanes, both small enough to be beneath the Accord's administrative attention, both willing enough that they asked no questions and kept no formal record of the arrangement. The Sulhari, when approached, had said only that they considered it a matter of basic decency, and that they would not charge a handling fee. The Sol exclusion zone, the bubble of human-controlled space that had held at 1 astronomical unit for 3 centuries, began to expand. Slowly, 1/100th of an AU per decade, sometimes less. The rate was calibrated not to the pace of human expansion, but to the sensitivity threshold of the Accord's monitoring instruments, the exact speed below which a boundary shift would register as drift rather than intention. Over 2 centuries, the zone expanded from 1 astronomical unit to 14. No Accord instrument registered the change. The operation was not concealed. It was simply conducted at the pace the Accord's instruments were not calibrated to detect. This is the part that people get wrong when they try to describe what happened during those 500 years. They call it hiding, they call it waiting. Both words are wrong and the difference matters. Waiting is the absence of action. What director Orang Castle designed, and what 3 more generations of her family maintained, each one trained from childhood in the specific work of the operation, was not absence. It was action at a frequency nothing nearby was calibrated to detect. The operation had a name, Long Recess. Long Recess was not a military program. It was not an economic one. It was a documentation program, the most thorough, most systematically maintained, most cross-referenced body of institutional record ever assembled by any species in the Accord's history. Its subject was not humanity. Its subject was the Accord itself. Every session transcript for 512 years. Every filed motion, every administrative ruling, every procedural violation committed by the Accord against every species in that hall, logged, cross-referenced, and archived in 9 synchronized quantum registry arrays aboard a vessel called the Meridian Claws, maintained at the edge of the Sol exclusion zone where no Accord instrument had looked in living memory. Dr. Seville Orath-Dreven, the woman who built the final index, had been doing it for 43 years. She was 69 when the session began. She spoke in the cadence of someone who had read more documents than conversations, which was true. She had read approximately 400,000 more documents than conversations over the course of her adult life, a fact she considered unremarkable. She carried a thumb-worn stylus she had never used for anything except marking cross-references. She had marked approximately 9 million of them. The youngest person on the team was analyst Drev Orath, 31 years old, responsible for managing the 9 arrays. He was visibly uncomfortable with stillness. He tapped his left knee in prime number intervals when he was anxious, 2 taps, then 3, then 5, then 7, cycling through the sequence without apparent awareness that he was doing it. He had been managing the full index for 4 years. He was the youngest person who had ever touched it. Commander Rel Casanorvath, 40, handled logistics, threat assessment, and the team's physical continuity. She carried no visible armament. Her version of threat assessment was a 3-second scan and a redirect. She had, in the 9 years she had held this role, never had to do anything louder. Linguist diplomat Sen Velorvan, 57, carried the procedural codes of 91 member species by memory. She had never once consulted a reference document during a live session. She considered this a minimum standard, not an achievement. When pressed on it, she noted that any protocol specialist who needed to look something up during a live session had already lost 3 seconds they would not get back. And then there was the one who stayed on the ship. Dr. Arvel Oran-Thesson, 74, institutional ethicist, the person who had decided what to include in the final submission, and more carefully what to leave out. He had not attended the session. He had eaten breakfast alone in the aft common room of the Meridian Claws, read 2 documents he had already read 40 times, and waited. He considered his absence a form of respect for the work. He also considered it a form of cowardice, and he was honest enough to hold both things at the same time. The 6th person on the team was Ambassador Convocant Usen Orang Castle. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Director Orang Castle, the woman who had written the 1,200-page proposal in a humid room 9 years before the vote. She was 44 years old, trained first as a proceduralist, and then as the designated lead voice for the operation, the person who would be standing at the podium when Long Recess ended. She had been preparing for this role since she was 12. She kept a thermos, brushed copper, engraved with a harbor skyline that had been worn almost to nothing across 4 generations of hands, warm to the touch regardless of its contents, dented at the base, from the first time it had been set on a stone table in a hall that no longer recognized her species as people. She poured from it before every session, never after. Over 300 years of the operation, 12 species were contacted. Not at once, not through any central channel the Accord could have detected. One by one, across decades, using back-channel courier routes maintained by the Dreven Freelanes, species too small to have voted no at the original reclassification, too ignored to be worth monitoring, and each one, in its own way, keeping its own record. The Yenu collective were 6-eyed, copper-complexioned, and old in the way that only scholar cultures get old. not in age, but in the specific weight of accumulated attention. Their representative had spent her equivalent of a human lifetime reading every human formal complaint filed with the Accord. All 847 of them, each one denied. She had grieved each denial in the Yenu way, which involved a sustained low harmonic that could last for days. And she had done this 847 times, alone in a reading room, and had never mentioned it to anyone. The Marak drift clans were pastoral, largely ignored and meticulous. A trade motion of theirs had been buried without acknowledgement 90 years into long recess. They had responded by starting their own parallel record of session irregularities, maintained across 200 years with the specific energy of people who had decided that if the system would not acknowledge what it did, they would acknowledge it themselves. The Sulhari Compact had been rerouting human trade through their lanes for 400 years without disclosure. When asked why, their representative said, "We did not keep a record because we did not think it needed to be a record. We thought it needed to be done." None of them were allies of convenience. None of them had been recruited. All of them had been watching, keeping their own count, waiting for something they could not have named but would recognize when they saw it. Each of them had filed a formal testimony request before the Meridian Clause docked at Soratha Prime. The Meridian Clause arrived on a Tuesday. 6 people, no armament. A petition filed under Article 9, Clause 4, the one not invoked in 211 years. The clerk who received it had to locate a physical procedural manual. It took her 7 minutes. She was apologetic about this. Usson told her it was fine. The hall at Soratha Prime looked exactly the way it looked in the institutional photographs from 500 years ago. Pale quarried stone from a collapsed star system, chosen because it does not warm to the touch no matter how many bodies fill the room. Ceilings at 38 meters, high enough that sound travels upward and disperses before it returns, which produces a specific effect on petitioners. The sense that their voices do not carry, that the room is too large for them, that the institution filling it is something they cannot match. The platform for presapient species was 3 steps below all the others. The same platform, the same 3 steps. Usson walked to the podium at the front of the platform, set her notes on the surface, and placed the thermos beside them. The harbor skyline was almost gone. You could see it only if you already knew what you were looking for. Drev Orath, at his station behind her, checked the 9 arrays one final time. Standard pre-session protocol. He ran the same check the same way he ran it before every session, methodical, unhurried, except that his knee had not stopped tapping since they docked, and his hand was slightly less steady than it usually was, and Rel, standing to his left, had given him one look that meant, "You're fine, we're fine, let's go." He checked the arrays. They were ready. The hall filled over the next 40 minutes. 847 member species, tens of thousands of delegates, representatives, secondary attaches, and administrative observers, the full convocation of the Sorathi Accord, assembled for what had been filed as a routine reinstatement hearing. Most of them had not read the petition. Most of them had assumed this would take 20 minutes. Several senior delegations had not sent their primary representatives. Usson watched them settle. She had a card in her hand. She set the thermos down and did not touch it again. She did not open with an argument. She opened with a name. Delegate Orathvel of the Sulhari border territories, 63 years old at the time of his censure. He appeared before this body in G-reckoning year 47 to request that contamination relief be reclassified as non-discretionary, meaning it could not be withheld on administrative grounds from any species that met the biological threshold for atmospheric harm. His motion was dismissed under Accord Administrative Statute 7, classified as procedurally premature, and sealed from the public record. He was censured for resubmitting it the following year. He died before a 3rd submission could be filed. She set the card down. She picked up the next one. Delegate Per Voran of the Drevin Outer Lanes, 51 years old at the time of her removal. She appeared before this body in G-reckoning year 63 to request an independent review of colony route assignments in the castle sector, following evidence that 3 routes had been redirected in a pattern that disproportionately limited Drevin expansion. Her motion was dismissed. Her documentation was classified under Accord Administrative Statute 7. She was removed from the delegate registry 6 months later on grounds of procedural interference. She appealed. The appeal was sealed. She set that card down. She picked up the next one. Commander Rel Casanorvath stepped to the secondary podium to Usson's left. She read the next name. Senvelorvan took the one after that. The rotation was calm, unhurried. Each name given the same weight, not more, not less, because the record did not mourn. The record simply knew. 847 names. Each one a filed motion, a formal complaint, a procedural challenge, a request for review. Each one denied, sealed, or dismissed under a statute designed to keep the record clean. Each one read in the order it had been buried. 4 hours and 9 minutes beginning to end. By the 200th name, the hall had stopped moving. By the 400th, the background hum of interspecies translation commentary, the constant, low-level whisper channel traffic that runs through any convocation session, had begun to thin. By the 600th, the whisper channels were dark. 1327. By the 800th name, the hall was the quietest place in the known galaxy. Not quiet the way a room goes quiet when something unexpected happens. Not the held breath kind of quiet that comes before an announcement, or the formal kind that protocol requires at certain moments in a session. This was a different thing entirely. This was the quiet that builds the way silt builds at the bottom of a slow river, layer by layer, name by name, each one settling on top of the last until the structure above it can no longer hold its own noise. The translation channels had gone dark. The delegates had stopped moving. The hall that had been engineered specifically to make petitioners feel small was, for the first time in its recorded history, making no sound at all. Usan read a name. Rel read the next. Sen read the one after that. The cadence did not change. It had not changed in 4 hours. It was not solemn. That is the thing that the hall could not answer, the thing that made the silence build rather than break. The record did not mourn. The record did not perform. It simply knew what it contained, and it read from itself calmly in the order things had been buried. 841, 842, 843. By now, several of the senior delegations who had sent secondary representatives were wishing they had come themselves. Several of the primary representatives who had come were wishing they had reviewed the petition before the session began. No one said this aloud. There was no channel left to say it in. 845, 846. Usan read the last name. Delegate Velorvan Thresh, of the Marak Outer Settlements. 48 years old at the time of her filing. She appeared before this body in G-Reckoning year 491 to request that the administrative record of her species' original trade motion, buried without acknowledgement in G-Reckoning year 209, be unsealed and entered into the public session record. Her motion was dismissed under Accord Administrative Statute 7. She was informed by written notice, sent to a transit address she had left 6 months prior, that the matter was considered resolved. Usan set the card down. She did not look up. 31 seconds. The hall did not erupt. It did not respond. It did not reach for a procedure or a countermotion or a recess request. It had already answered, somewhere around the 400th name, when the translation channels started going dark. It had already given the only answer available to a body that had just heard 4 hours of its own conduct, read back to it by the people it had classified as animals. 31 seconds is not a long time. In a hall engineered to project institutional weight, with 38-meter ceilings and stone that does not warm to the touch, 31 seconds of complete silence from tens of thousands of delegates is a very specific experience. It sounds like nothing. It weighs like everything. Then Grand Convocant Soreth Velorvan called the procedural motion. His voice, in that silence, sounded like something that had forgotten how loud it used to be. No eruption, no announcement, no answer. The motion was for reinstatement to senior member status, the tier that carries full veto authority over Accord administrative decisions, budget allocations, and classification proceedings. The motion required a simple majority of present delegates. It passed 803-0. The other 44, said Drev Orath, quietly from his station behind the podium, are species who are, at this precise moment, aware that their own sessions are already in the index. No one laughed. It was not a joke. The thermos stayed on the podium. Usan did not pick it up. She gathered her notes, checked that the 9 arrays had completed their formal transfer to the Accord's session record. They had. Drev had flagged the confirmation 11 seconds after the vote, and she walked off the platform in the same direction she had come from, with the same unhurried step, without looking back. Commander Rel fell in behind her. Then Sen. Then Drev, who had finally stopped tapping his knee, and who would not realize this until later that evening when someone pointed it out, and he sat with the information for a moment before saying he hadn't noticed. Dr. Seville Oreth Dreven was the last to leave. She closed the 9 arrays in sequence, each one requiring a manual confirmation, standard archival protocol, the same she had run 43 years of working sessions. She checked each confirmation against her log. She made one cross-reference note, because there was a secondary citation she had flagged 3 months ago and wanted to verify had been included in the transfer. It had been. She capped her stylus and walked out. Behind them, the hall began the slow process of remembering how to make noise. The thermos sat on the podium surface, the harbor skyline worn almost to nothing, catching what light came through the upper windows at that hour. The session clerks began their standard post-session filing. They moved around the thermos. They filed around it for the rest of that day, and through the next, and into the third day before someone, a junior records clerk, 22 years old, 2 months into her posting, stopped and looked at it and understood that it had been left there on purpose. That it was not an oversight. That it was the only statement the delegation had made that was not in the index. She noted it in the session record as personal effects deliberately placed, no retrieval request filed, status, permanent exhibit per Article 12, subsection 9, unclaimed institutional items of record. The record was accurate. That evening, aboard the Meridian Clause, the aft common room held 2 people and 2 copper cups and a pot of real tea, not the processed kind that keeps in transit storage, but the actual kind, leaves steeped in water, because Dr. Arvel Oranthesen had been saving it for this specific night for 6 years, and had carried it on board in a sealed container that took up space he could not technically justify in the cargo manifest, and had justified anyway. Elder Vas Relamera of the Yenu Collective sat across from him. She was old in the way that Yenu elders get old, not fragile, just deep, the way water gets deep when the riverbed drops. Her harmonic grief, which had lasted through the full session and for 2 hours after docking, had settled now into something quieter. A low hum barely audible, the kind you feel in your chest before you hear it. Arvel poured. The cups were copper, harbor skyline etched on the side, the same image as the thermos, not a copy, just a coincidence of taste, because the harbor had been the view from the original director's office, and the pattern had moved through the family the way small things move through families, without anyone deciding to keep it. They drank in silence for a while. Then the elder said, "Why did you wait so long?" Arvel looked at his cup. "You had enough after a century," she said. "I read the files. After 100 years, the index had enough to make the case. After 200, it was complete. Why 512? He was quiet for a moment. Not the way people are quiet when they are deciding what to say, but the way people are quiet when the answer is something they have carried for a long time and are not sure yet how to set it down. "We wanted to be certain," he said, "that we were returning to build something." He set his cup on the table. "Not simply to be right. The memorial wall of the Meridian Clause runs the full length of the starboard corridor, from the forward observation bay to the aft hatch. It holds stone tiles, 847 of them, one for each delegate named in the session record. Each tile is roughly the size of a hand. Each one was placed by whoever was the current keeper of the archive at the time of the anniversary, 1 tile per year, for 847 years, which means the wall was begun 135 years before anyone knew if long recess would ever reach a session. Most of the keepers who placed those tiles never expected to see this day. They placed their tile. They passed the operation forward. They trained the next keeper in the specific work of the index, the way you train someone in a craft, not by explaining the goal, but by showing them the motion, the method, the patience required to do the work at the pace the work requires. And then they died, most of them before the next tile was laid, and the next keeper placed theirs and passed it forward and died in turn. 847 tiles. 847 years. A wall built by people who would never see what it was for, tended by people who only knew that it needed to be tended, running the full length of a corridor in a ship that spent 5 centuries at the edge of a zone that no Accord instrument had looked at in living memory. Usson stood in front of it that night, alone, after the others had gone to their quarters. She ran her hand along the row near the middle, the tiles placed during her great-great-grandmother's time, the first keeper, the one who had set the thermos on the stone table and walked out without a word. The tiles from that era were the oldest ones on the wall. They had been touched the most. Each anniversary, each passing keeper had run a hand along this section, the way you acknowledge something without saying it aloud. The stone was smooth. Not polished smooth, worn smooth. The specific texture of something that has been touched so many times that the surface has given up its roughness to the accumulation of contact. You can feel the difference if you know what to look for. She knew what to look for. The vote passed 803-0 in a hall that had forgotten how to make noise, and the Sorathi Convocation Accord added 1 senior member to its registry, with full veto authority, effective immediately, per the procedural requirements of Article 9, Clause 4, the clause not invoked in 211 years. The administrative record was updated the same day. The 44 abstaining species filed no formal statement. They were not required to. Their sessions were already in the index, and the index had been transferred to the Accord's own session record under Article 9, subsection 3, Public Disclosure Statute, which meant it was now the Accord's record, not humanity's, not the coalition's, but the institution's own, and it would remain there, searchable, cross-referenced, and publicly accessible, for as long as the Accord maintained its records. Which it would. That was, after all, the thing it did best. 3 days after the session, the junior clerk's notation was entered into the permanent exhibit register. The thermos became, officially, Exhibit 1 of Session Record G-Reckoning 512, Reinstatement Hearing, Article 9, Clause 4. The harbor skyline, what remained of it, was photographed for the archival record. The photograph showed an image so worn it was more suggestion than image. If you did not know it was a harbor, you would not know it was a harbor. The clerk noted in her filing, object appears to have been in continuous use prior to placement. Engraving consistent with significant handling across extended period. Recommend archival preservation treatment. She paused. Then she added, recommend treatment be delayed until further consultation with the depositing party regarding their intentions for the object. She was 22 years old. She had been in her posting for 2 months. She had, in that note, understood something that the Accord's senior administrative tier had not. The depositing party had intentions. They always had. The silence had never been empty. It had been staffed, maintained, cross-referenced, and handed forward, year by year and generation by generation, by people who understood that the most durable record of what power does is the one that power assumes no one is keeping. Usson left the corridor and went to sleep. In the morning, she would begin the work of what came next, the charter amendments, the administrative restructuring, the slow, procedural process of becoming something permanent rather than something restored. There was a great deal to do. There had always been a great deal to do. That was, in a way, the point. But that was the morning. That night, the wall held its tiles in the dark of the corridor, all 847 of them, running from the forward bay to the aft hatch in a line that had taken longer to complete than most civilizations last. The one near the middle, the oldest, the most touched, was worn smooth down the center, where 847 years of hands had passed over it.